I greet you once more in the precious name of Jesus as we continue on the structuring of the cell-structured church. We're doing chapter 5 in this lesson, and I'm going to be talking about a combined structure. We looked at the Jethro or the 5x5 system. We saw how that is structured, how you work through your cell leaders, your zone supervisors, zone pastors, and district pastors, and then the senior pastor. And then we went through onto the G12 system, which actually eliminates the need for the zone supervisor, zone pastor, or district pastor, and therefore can be a system which can be used effectively in the third world to grow a large church at little cost. I now want to look at combining those two structures together because this is also possible. See, we need to understand that the cell structure is simply a structure to enable us to fulfill the purpose of the church. It's not a miracle formula that is going to make a church grow if the people within that church are not properly trained and mobilized to reach out and to win the lost for Jesus. But in itself, it can be a system if it's correct for your area, and also if it's in God's planning, that can truly bring an explosion of growth, as we've seen in Ivory Coast and Bogota and other places. So let's look at a combined structure which many churches are now calling the J12 model, taking the G12 and the Jethro system and somewhat combining them. In some societies, having more than one cell meeting per week, which is the G12. Remember that everybody in the G12 goes to a cell and also leads a cell in the same week. And this can be a problem in some areas of society, putting a lot of pressure on the leadership that need to lead those cells. For this reason, you can decide to combine the best of both structures. The physical structure can remain intact. For example, we can go by the 5x5 system to have the actual structuring of the cells. We can have 5 cells per zone supervisor forming a subzone, 5 subzones forming a zone, and 5 zones forming a district, as we discussed under the Jethro system. But then you can apply the following G12 principles to that structure, which are really the strengths of the G12 system. Firstly, every member is viewed as a potential leader. In the Jethro system, we develop 2 or 3 interns in one cell, and finally have one that takes cell leadership when the cell multiplies. In the G12 system, the system looks at every believer to have the potential to be a leader over 12 people, and therefore trains every person to become a cell group leader. It's a very strong point, and therefore it can be included into the other bases of the Jethro system. Major emphasis is then placed on leadership development. Secondly, leaders are released more easily to rapidly grow new cells. Instead of a cell waiting to multiply, if a potential leader has 3 genuine cell members, he can be released to plant a cell. See, in the Jethro system, remember, we waited until the cell got to 15, and then we multiplied it by taking 7 and 8 and starting 2 cells out of that one cell. The G12 system does not work on that basis at all. In fact, as soon as a person has done the equipping tracks, they can now move out and begin a new cell and begin to grow that cell, which has a much more rapid effect of growing the numbers in the church. This will only take place with the permission of the zone pastor, and the new cell leader may not take any existing cell members, but only new members. I want you to see from this that these are the differences that you can do in your own structuring. Basically, when you look at the J12 system, it has been set up by churches who are not comfortable with the control that you have in the G12 system. Although you don't need the zone supervisors, the zone pastors, district pastors, and therefore cut down the whole cost structure of the church, resulting in a vibrant church in a poorer economic climate being able to develop much faster. Many pastors are not happy with the control that you can get from the G12 system, because there's very little monitoring, because there's nobody to monitor. Everything that you get is fed down through cell leaders and is fed back through those same cell leaders. There's no cell supervisor, at least a district supervisor or a district pastor that can monitor those and feed them back with surety to the senior pastor. So the J12 is really a system that's been developed to make use of the rapid growth potential of the G12 and yet still have the ability to monitor and control the system. When we look at Africa, I think that in many parts of Africa, society is well established for the G12 system. But the point that we're looking at in combining the structure is you can assess the situation that you have in your community, and also according to your character as a leader, and adjust the system to fit what will work for you and what will work for the area. Cells multiply at 12 in this system now instead of at 15 as in the Jethro system. Most cells have been found to stabilize around about 10 members. So actually, getting to 15 becomes a much more aggressive process from 10 to 15 than what it is to get to 10. And therefore, 12 seems to be a number that is more easily reached in the multiplication of the cell church. The leadership development strategy of a G12 structure is applied. In other words, your equipping tracks is that you use in this system is the G12's equipping tracks. In the Jethro system, it takes 6 months to a year to equip a cell leader to where you want them in the whole structuring of the Jethro. In the G12 system, it takes 4 weekends if they work hard during the week to achieve the same result. And therefore, you can bring about a very much quicker multiplication by combining these two systems. Leadership meetings as designed in G12 model still take place, but only on a monthly basis. So in other words, every month, each cell leader will have fellowship with those who are responsible over them, which did not occur in the Jethro system. This can also be doubled to 2 meetings a month, and making the one meeting for administration and the other a spiritual input meeting. The level of a zone pastor does not exist in the J12 structure. So although we still have the zone supervisor, the system has been modified so that it does allow the exclusion of the zone pastor, and therefore you end up with a district pastor who is over your zone supervisors, thereby going halfway along the road to reducing the costs of the structure. Let me just say this though. Even the Jethro system is very much more cost-effective than the program system within the church. If you look at the pastoring staff needed in the Jethro system compared to a normally programmed church, already on average, there's a saving of more than 25% of the staff complement needed. In the G12 system, there's only 25% needed, not a cutting of 25%. In this combined system, it ends up at about 50% of the need of a programmed church. Relationships are maintained by the following meetings. Senior pastor has weekly meetings with pastors, full-time personnel. Pastors have monthly cell meetings with their zone supervisors. Zone supervisors have monthly cell meetings with their cell leaders and in their subzones. Cell leaders have normal cell meetings with church members and invited visitors every week. So you see, in that structuring, we've made a compromise. We try to marry the two systems. The J12 system is actually beginning to work extremely effectively in many churches, but so does the Jethro system, as Dr. Yonggi Chow has already proved, and so does the G12 system, as has been proved in the church in Bogota in Colombia. So every one of these cell structures that we have been looking at and discussing and looking at the structure of them, they will work efficiently if all the principles that have been taught are applied. It really depends on what is suited to your church, to your region, and it needs to be assessed properly. I want to talk now for a little on the preparation phase checklist for a transitioning of a church, from a programmed church to a cell church. We have already talked about sowing a cell church and all the preparation that goes into that. But we only previously touched on transitioning a programmed church into a cell church. And I want to go through a checklist now that will be very valuable to you in that transitioning period. We have two columns in this. On the left-hand side, we have leaders. On the right-hand side, we have members. For the leaders, experience and model cell life. Remember, in our earlier lesson, we came to the understanding that unless the leadership in the church understands the cell process and life within the cell, they will never transmit that effectively to their congregation. So leaders need to experience and model cell life for the church. The members need to learn about cell life. Leaders, step number 1. Senior pastor plus 3 potential pastoral leaders form a leadership cell with their spouses. Members, step number 1. Teach cell principle and concept to church members who are not a part of the leadership cell. Step number 2. For the leaders, choose 9 potential leaders and study the cell concepts together. The whole buzzword here is don't rush things. Remember, you are taking people through what is quite a fundamental change in their understanding of how church works. We also saw whenever you change something, people lose something. And they need to be convinced that what they are losing, they're going to benefit more by what they're moving into than what they've lost. So it needs to be a gradual process that's done properly. Otherwise, the loss is going to be too great. Take the congregation and make zones of 60 to 250 adults. If you have a large church, begin to do the spade work of how you're going to structure that under your new system long before you begin to implement it. Remember step number 4, empower the leadership team to make them responsible to minister to the zone members. Step number 5, leaders to assign a leadership team using your 12. That is 9 plus 3 trained leaders to each of the zones. 1 leader for every 50 people. Members, step number 5. Challenge every member of the church to become a part of cell groups. Step number 6 for leaders, choose 5 potential leaders from each congregation to become cell leaders and begin training them. Members, step number 6, have a special event which launches the cell groups. See, it's only at this point that we are now beginning to make this public to all the members of the church. Leaders, step number 7, form 5 leadership cells using the people in step 6. Invite leaders to join these cells. Use the people from step 5 to supervise these cells. Challenge your members to become leaders. Generation cells. These new cells will come from step 7. In turns will come from the congregation. So we've seen in those preparation steps that it's very necessary, step by step, to begin to prepare the way to transition your church into the cell church structure. If you do not do it effectively and with pre-planning, you are going to have a mess on your hands. You're going to lose a lot of members unnecessarily, and not only that, you will get to the point where you've made a transition and you don't really know what to do. You've got to, as leaders, experience those steps. Start your cell first. Experience cell life. Experience the challenges so that you can develop the ability to bring your church into the transition phase. Understanding restructuring from programs. Many leaders start at this stage not realizing that a careful foundation must be laid in terms of vision, values, learning, and discipleship. The result of beginning with restructuring without proper preparation is disastrous. Remember also that a part of that preparation is just asking yourself some hard questions as to where your church members are. Some churches are not ready for change, and it would be disastrous to try and bring a change. You've got to be able to assess where your members are at and whether they are ready to make change. This step involves continual fine-tuning the initial cell system and introducing the levels of zone supervisor and zone pastor. The entire system will grow smoothly if we continually involve training and internship at every level. Monkey see, monkey do. I learned this step, I pass this step on. I learned the next step, I pass that step on. There's a constant learning and training in the transition. Don't even think that once you've gone through the materials that we've given you on the cell church, that you are now ready to structure your total church and just swing into the new cell structure. You will have a disaster on your hands. Yes, you need the training, but then you need to go slowly, step by step, into the process and take your people with you. Promise your people that you will not take them or make them do things that they're not ready for. Understand that the best way to remove a toy from a child is to offer something else instead. Continually report through public testimony and by statistic how God is working through the cell groups. Let me just make this clear. It's not because cell groups are not biblical. It's not because the change is not biblical. I think both structures of the church are biblical. The problems with change are people are not comfortable with change. They have to be taken in those steps of change. When the church learned a new way to worship, nobody wanted to go that way in the beginning. Everybody wanted the old traditional hymns and the organ playing because that's what they thought church was. That's what they were comfortable with. There were also many churches who tried to take their people through that transitioning phase, and they had many, many casualties along the way. If they'd taken them with proper preparation, one step at a time, like some churches did, the casualty list was very, very much reduced. So we got to see that people just struggle to make fundamental changes. This will let people know how God is working through the cells and that it is a system that can replace the programs. Even if they are small, you should be initiating zone supervisors training meetings for those entering the ministry. Begin to reward your cell leaders with recognition and ways to make them feel that they're a part of something great that's coming. You've got to bring enthusiasm and vision into mobilizing your people. Building a base congregation. A cell church should grow at a constant rate. But if the critical mass of 120 committed leaders is reached, then exponential growth can be experienced. It will increase rapidly. Base congregation, the minimum amount of people in a church capable of producing a self-sustaining chain reaction of multiplying the cell. Don't look at yourself as a church when you're one cell. Look at yourself as a beginning cell. If you're that small, develop the cell. When that cell has got to 15, then multiply the cell. If you're under the Jethro system. It's only when you get to at least 50 people that you need to consider to start having celebration meetings and begin to operate as a church. Mobilizing leaders. We need to understand the mobilizing stage. In this stage, the transition or planting begins more in earnest as you turn your focus from learning to doing. Your utmost goal in this phase is to recruit and develop as many leaders as possible. This in turn involves learning and implementing the roles of supervisor and zone pastor. There must always be an ongoing interning and multiplication of leaders on every level. See, one thing that is a major benefit in the cell structure of church is in the programmed church, you can have pew warmers. Because programs are laid out with people, you can have many people within the church who do very little but come to church on Sundays. If a cell church is going to work, you cannot have the same thing in the cell church. The people have to be trained. They have to be mobilized. They have to become an integral part of the whole cell process. If you can, have that happen effectively, then you are going to have a rapidly growing cell church. But that is the challenge. It is a constant training, equipping, and releasing process. But that is very biblical in that it teaches us in Ephesians in chapter 4 that the fivefold ministry is for the equipping of the saints for the work of the ministry. So in that sense, with a cell structure, if you get everybody participating and growing into leadership, it is a biblical pattern. As you develop and appoint new leaders, multiplying cell groups, you can also begin to communicate the vision and values in a stronger manner. Don't preach cell church. It's not going to bring about what God wants to do through changing your structure. Preach the New Testament body life and outreach. Preach the necessity to evangelize. Preach the necessity to love one another. Preach the necessity of fellowship. Preach the necessity of close relationship. Those are the things that actually prepare people for cell church life. You get many people who are going around preaching the cell church, preaching it as the answer. The cell church is a structure. It's how you present God's plan within that that'll make the church effective and not the structure. That is why so often you see churches that are not even very well structured in the program sense growing very rapidly because there is life and vision in that church, and life and vision brings growth. Structure will never bring growth. Structure will enable you to handle rapid growth. Structure will enable you to train people to enhance that rapid growth. But structure on its own will never bring growth. And we need to understand that. So don't get, convinced on the cell system and then begin to preach it. Preach to your people on the essentials of practical life within the church and relationship. It is essential that people see the cell church as a part of the biblical way of doing things and not the pastor's latest idea. And don't present it as the only model. We so often make this mistake in the church. Within our movement or within a number of churches comes a refreshing or something like that by the Holy Spirit, and suddenly that's the only way to be in the church. And we make our brothers feel uncomfortable. We make them feel like we think they're second class, and it's just crazy. God has many models. And God has many models for different churches. And certain churches are suited to certain models. God also has in His heart and plan for some churches to become city churches or even national churches that'll impact a nation. He doesn't have it in His plan for every church to do that. So it's important to find God's heart for your church, for your structuring, for your community, and then operate in that. But you need for your people to see that the structure you want to move into is biblical, and share with them the vision that God has laid upon your heart so that they don't think it's just another idea that their pastors had. Realize that the biggest question in people's mind is, how is this going to affect them? So what everybody's going to ask themselves the moment you share new vision with them. What's it going to do in my life? What am I going to be expected to do? See, even on the transition where in the cell church, we need to end up with the cells evangelizing, or this structure will have no strength and effectiveness in it. But if you're going to present that in the initial phase so powerfully, everybody's just going to see, this is now what's going to be expected of me. To go and stand and shout and spit on every corner, knock on everybody's door, and you frighten the life out of people before you've even moved them into a new system. So you've got to understand that principle. The moment you share new vision, before people normally think about what will this do for the kingdom, they first think, how will this affect me? So a good leader will take his people through that process and let them understand what he's moving into. You must answer their questions. You must make it clear that no one will be forced to do anything. Keep your ear to the ground and discover the plans of Satan that he has to create confusion and miscommunication, because he'll try his best. Keep praying and respond to the people's honest questions with clear communication. Don't get offended if your people want to ask you questions. Of course they're going to have questions. It's not that they don't trust you as their pastor. It's that they're going into ground that they don't know, new ground, and they need to ask about things. Some people may take years before getting involved in the cell groups. This is a problem of transitioning a church. Perhaps some never will. Do not be overly concerned about that. If they're a part of your church and they are valuable members of your church, you've got to make room for them so that they can continue to fellowship within your church, even if they're not a part of the cell system. Great numbers of casualties have been caused in some churches because the pastor has come to a point where he says, right, either you become a member of a cell or you're no longer a member of this church. That's not the right way to treat someone who is in your home or a part of your home, which is the local church. Amen. So we need to be careful about those things and see the reality in them. As you involve new people in leadership roles, realize that you will have to let go of some of the existing programs and activities to free people to give themselves fully without burning out. You can't run two systems parallel forever. There has to come a slow transition from the one system to the other system. The selection of leaders provides the foundation that God will be building on. Continue to soak your leadership recruitment in prayer and training. Even Jesus did not presume to rely on his own wisdom always, but intensely prayed and sought God's wisdom on many things. If he needed to seek the Spirit's guidance, how much more do we need to in our ministries? Build your new leadership also from new converts. This is a very, very wise piece of information or encouragement. You know, sometimes we are inclined to want to take only the mature people in the faith to raise them up to leadership. You got to be careful that those people don't have a lot of, very strong set thinking, because perhaps they're not going to change with you. And if you put them in leadership, that's going to further complicate your whole transitioning period. But if you are using people who have come new into the church, they've virtually been brought into the church in its transformation to a cell church, that is what they will understand as church. And if they have leadership potential and you develop it, they will make good leaders in the church. So build always, and don't be afraid to bring new converts into leadership if you're able to bring them there with training. Don't let the initial groups become overfull, as this will diminish outreach effectiveness. What I mean by that is, you started with 3. You then increased it. You got your own cell. You then began to multiply the cell. If you're not careful in your preparation, you won't have prepared enough cell leaders to start the whole process. And if the initial cell becomes too full, the whole system becomes troublesome, and you'll create problems for yourself instead of a smooth transition. I want you just to look at this diagram. In the first circle at the top, you see initial leadership, which is 3 to 12 visionaries that are going to work with a senior pastor. Second circle, you have the support core, which is 30 to 40 committed leaders that have now been developed through those 12 people. And then in the third and largest circle, you have your base congregation, which is 120 to 200 people of one mind with cell church vision, values, structure, and leadership. So in transitioning your cell, you need to major on those people who are going to come with you initially. You need to develop them. You need to have them develop others until you get that core group. Once you've got that core group, then you can begin to really transition into the new structure of running your church. I want to carry on now with chapter 7, and that is the expanding phase. So we've seen the preparation phase, the mobilization phase, and now we're going to talk about the expanding phase, understanding the expansion phase. The phase is marked by growing expansion of new Christians, new leaders, and new cells. It should create fresh penetration strategies into new population groups and church planting. If you think back to the training that we did in the process number 3 on working on your area of influence in evangelization, then you realize that as the church moves into that cell principle, suddenly your ability to reach the community expands very rapidly if people are mobilized and they begin to reach out in their area of influence. This phase requires a heightened listening to God. As you begin to reach out in an increased way, there will be many opportunities. You will need to cover every one of these in prayer and with the wisdom of God. You will need to teach the cells and the zones to become increasingly active also in spiritual warfare, in prayer. At this phase, your church should exhibit the following characteristics: at least 120 adult members, 12 to 15 healthy cells, a leadership structure, an equipping track in place, edification and operating in the presence of the power of the Holy Spirit, an evangelism strategy, accountability and reporting mechanisms, intern development on all levels, and a prayer strategy. Once you have those things in place, then you are ready to launch into rapid growth and into this expanding phase. Let's talk about reporting. We want to track the attendance of each cell on a weekly basis so that we can determine the cell members' faithfulness and their ability to reach out to the world around them. Many of the cell churches, especially those who transitioned, this has been their greatest challenge. They've been able to form the cells. They've been able to get the whole mechanism into place. They've even, succeeded in the equipping tracks and producing good interns. But the mobilization of people within the cells to evangelize has remained a challenge to many of the churches. The only way to see where this is at is to monitor it. Every week report should be completed and given to the district pastor who will process the information. The pastors can draw graphs showing overall growth of the church. The zone supervisors also submit a report on the cells that they visited, the problems, and so on and so forth. What is a cell report? A good cell report will answer the following question: what happened this week in cell life that was cause for praise or concern? It's the one thing as well that makes the cell church an effective base. You can have weekly feedback very simply through the whole cell structure. As we saw in the G12 system, even if the church grows very large, every week you have contact going down and coming back up again. So you can effectively assess where your church is on a weekly basis if the monitoring is working correctly. The critical questions of a cell report are: was the ministry operated at the meeting in a practical sense and powerful to encourage people and to bring change in their situation? Did a quiet person share deep need or biblical truth for the first time? This is important because it will indicate to you whether your cells are beginning to operate in a way that people relax. Cell church is not home group meetings. You have to make the distinction between the two. In a home group meeting, you have praise and worship, you have preaching of some sort, and then you have some fellowship over coffee and tea at the end of the meeting. The whole cell structure is not based on that form of home church. It is based for practical interrelationship so that people can relate with one another, study the word, meet one another's needs, grow and become relaxed in their ability to be accountable to one another. So these pointers tell you where your cell is at. Were there any salvations during the cell meetings? Were the 4 W's covered? Welcome, worship, word, and works, because that's got to be the basis of all the cell structure. So that comments can also be included in that report back. Contact details of new members. Were the new people that made decisions in the church on Sunday in your celebration meeting, were they followed up in that very same week within the cell church? People who visited your church for the first time, was that processed through the whole cell process, and were those people visited just to show love and also support to them? Statistics. Statistics of each cell district, zone and subzone, and overall church growth should be recorded. This will help in managing the church by identifying the trends and helping in the decision-making process. When I was up in Abidjan at Dr. Robert's church for his conference last year, I was amazed to see just how structured that church is right in a third world context. I mean, they were aware exactly of what had happened in the church that week. How many people had come to Jesus in the cells? How many, people had received ministry in the cells? They also knew the exact structure of their different departments. I was amazed to see that within his evangelization department, and remember, these evangelists work mainly through the cell process, he had 748 trained evangelists that were also working through the whole cell groups. And he had, I forget the number now, but it was thousands of cell leaders were at the conference in their own section. So through the cell process, you can have a very good structure even in a society that is not terribly structured, because the structure is so set up that it's easily to monitor if you do it on a weekly basis. Spiritual mapping and penetration strategies. Before launching or expanding a ministry, nothing is as crucial as the creation of a penetration strategy. How are we going to do this thing? What are the methods that we're going to put in place, and how are we going to reach the goals that we believe that the Lord has laid on our heart? It is as important to the cell church as a business to plan how you are going to achieve this. In a city or area, A strategy is absolutely necessary if this whole area will be reached or evangelized. A cell group strategist seeks to develop a pattern that will be effective in reaching all the peoples or groups present. And as we saw earlier in our lessons, it is so easy to develop interest group cells. It's easy to get into business. It's easy to get into sports and recreation. So with the right strategy, you can actually reach most of the community that you live in. Without question, spiritual eyes will discern strongholds of Satan within the city as the study develops. When one evaluates districts of sin and evil in the city, it is necessary to remember that the battle we fight is not against flesh and blood. We need to break those powers and strongholds, and we need to reach the people. We cannot be against the people. We can only be against the forces of evil that are in control of those people. Let those who are spiritually blind to spiritual warfare stay away from developing spiritual mapping. Especially in the third world countries, it is imperative to discern territorial spirits and to do spiritual warfare. All spirits of divination, sorcery, witchcraft, ancestral worship, and Satanism should be destroyed by the power of prayer. Detailed attention should be given to the above practices or to people who have been involved with these practices or who have such involvement in their bloodline. This area is to be dealt with during the victory encounter, which we have already done. So we see from the lessons that we have been through that the cell structure is an effective structure if applied properly. It needs constant training and development to make it effective. It is an aggressive form of church in which every member is mobilized to become involved in its community. But it is a structure which in the right situation can have great effect upon our continent.
Jesus is alive in our